All right. Well, again, welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you here today for our 6th Leadership Summit of the Great Wardens Project. Today, we're going to be talking about navigating accountability, both sort of what accountability looks like, and then also how to navigate that actual accountability conversation. And hopefully we'll be able to have some good discussion, to provide some tools to help folks out as they navigate those conversations. The mission of our Great Wardens Project is to provide mentorship and training to develop bold prison leaders and build a corrections culture based on safety and dignity. We have a couple core beliefs, the first being that wardens and superintendents, and really, corrections leaders in general, have a responsibility to promote safe, secure, and healthy corrections facilities. And then secondly, that advocates and prison leaders can work together to reimagine how corrections facilities operate, and to shape a new generation of committed corrections professionals. I assume at this point that folks are probably really well versed in Zoom tech, but just really briefly, please keep yourselves muted unless you want to participate in the conversation, which I absolutely encourage everyone to do. You can have yourself on video if you'd like to, if you're able to. It's certainly not necessary. And then, of course, if you have any questions or any thoughts and you don't want to speak up, please feel free to use the chat. We will be monitoring that for any questions and for any thoughts. All right, so let me introduce our speakers today. And I believe I saw that Eric has joined us. So my name is Jessica Sedano-Seipel. I'm a senior program director with Just Detention International. Art, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Art, are you there? Art, can you hear me? I think you're muted. There you go.
I'm longer. Hi, I'm Art Taylor. I'm a retired warden from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and I currently work as a consultant with the North Carolina Department of Adult Corrections, which just changed its name and became a standalone department on January 1st.
Wow, thank you. And then finally, we have Mr. Eric Aldridge. I'm not sure if his audio is hooked up yet.
Could be. Can you hear me?
There you are. Yes, we can hear you. Welcome.
Sorry, a little technical malfunction back here, but
no worries.
Glad to be on. Eric Aldridge, Beaumont Correctional Center here in Virginia, Department of Corrections. I've been with the department 27 years.
Wow, welcome. Thank you so much. The Great Wardens Project is really sort of founded on the principle of bringing wardens together to support one another. And as you can see, we have quite a few wardens and former wardens who are on our task force, representing all kinds of parts of the country. There are several of our task force members that are here right now. If you want to introduce yourselves in the chat, I think some folks already have, but welcome to everyone, whether you're on the task force or not. And as I mentioned earlier, this is really not a training. This is more of a discussion session. And I think we all have a lot to learn from each other. And so I really want to encourage folks to participate, as much as they can. If you want to raise your hand in order to speak, please feel free to do so. You can do that right here under the reactions button. There's a little raise hand feature. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. I do want to start actually with a quote from our esteemed presenter, Eric. This is something that he told me as we were sort of preparing for these conversations, that accountability is only accomplished through humility on both ends. Eric, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this quote and kind of what it means to you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I just truly believe that the direct report as well as the supervisor has to be teachable. Ultimately, both have to be teachable. Taking some responsibility for the expectations on both sides, owning a piece of it. So humility to me is ultimately just having a receptive mind to be teachable, understanding, and that each side comes in with a conciliatory demeanor when it comes to holding to account. Yeah, we many times struggle with holding people to account. And I do believe it starts with the person in the mirror.
Thank you. Art, was there anything you wanted to add to that sentiment?
No, Eric and I have talked about this, and we've talked many times about this has to be a two-way street to be effective. When it's only a one-way street on either side, accountability is not effective. We don't think that it should be a one-way street. We think it needs to be a two-way street. But we're pragmatic enough to know that sometimes it may end up a one-way street. I think that's the issue, that you have to do everything you can to make sure as a leader in the organization that it's a two-way street.
Great, thank you so much. And I do want to just really ground us with a common understanding of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about accountability, particularly as opposed to responsibility. Now, they obviously go hand in hand. Responsibility is really just the obligation to complete your tasks, your job duties, right? Whereas accountability is the acceptance of the outcome, right? Regardless of your intention, it's the acceptance of the outcome, good, bad, or indifferent, that your actions had on a particular situation. I do want to show a really brief video here that I think really kind of illustrates where corrections leaders can fall and what some of the issues that come up when there's distrust between staff and leadership. So bear with me just one moment. I'm going to play just a few minutes of this video here. All right, and please let me know in the chat if there's any sound issues.
So accountability and responsibility, the first thing I think about is, okay, so in this profession, we do demand people who are going to step up. So we do want professionals with a high level of integrity, right? Now, with that said, you do want them to step up for the right reasons. So if I make a mistake, I'm not stepping up because I'm afraid of the consequences. I'm not stepping up because I'm afraid I'm going to be discovered. I'm stepping up because it's the right thing to do. I made a mistake. It's the right thing to do. But the environment also has to allow those individuals the opportunity to step up. And what I mean by that is, do we have an environment that the individuals can trust? And that's where it comes down to leadership. If you have leadership that is strictly CYA, cover their own ass, quick to discipline, then you're going to find out that you can't be trusted. And therefore, if frontline can't trust you because they feel that when they go to tell you something, you as a supervisor, not even a leader, is going to quickly cover your own ass or quickly go to discipline without looking for maybe the chance to cultivate, grow, but instead you rather just separate yourself from the team, the employee is not going to trust you enough to admit that they made a mistake. And therefore you wind up having a facility that just covers their mistakes as opposed to letting management know. What's your thoughts on that trust?
So, I mean, certainly we want to have an environment that's cultivating trust. We want an environment that, people feel comfortable to come forward and admit that they've made a mistake, and I think in order for us to get there, we do have to establish an environment where it's not about blame, but it's about the partnership, right? Because if you make a mistake, you grow, I grow, hopefully we all learn from that mistake, as opposed to someone discovering the mistake after the fact and then the outcome being even worse than what we thought it would have been if we would have identified it early on and addressed it head on.
Yeah, and it's great that you mentioned outcome, because as a good leader, sometimes we're faced with pressures that may limit our chance to educate. And therefore what happens here, an employee makes a mistake, and because maybe there's a time pressure, or maybe there is just pressure from management to, showcase discipline, because sometimes that happens as well. You're not put in a position where you can be effective. You're not put in a position where you can have an environment that promotes accountability, because again, with accountability comes responsibility. And with responsibility comes the kind of the first step of being a good leader yourself. So I want management to know that sometimes they don't realize, but when you have, when you're in charge of those direct supervisors, right? And those direct supervisors oversee the actions of their employees. And let's say they have good employees, and yes, they have bad employees. You know, when you have those good employees, you do want to promote honesty. You want to promote a level of integrity, and you want them to come up and admit when they make a concern. Now, if you have an environment that discourages that, those good employees start not trusting you, and they start hiding their mistakes. And in corrections, hiding mistakes could definitely fall into violations of safety and security. So as much as I want to put the onus on employees for stepping up and doing the right thing, we also at a management level should do whatever we can not to discourage them from doing the right thing, which means that when management applies pressure to those frontline supervisors to produce, sometimes they don't realize that that pressure could inadvertently affect the front line when they make a mistake, because now management doesn't have time to cultivate, doesn't have time to educate. And then because they're faced with pressure, they do what most managers tend to do: cover their ass. Let me just cover my ass. Let me write this discipline and move forward with it. But
All right. Let me go ahead and get these slides back up. And Eric or Art, are there any thoughts that either of you have about what we just watched?
Go ahead, Eric.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that was spot on. Really, that's what we're trying to cultivate, is an environment where people feel like they can come forward and disclose things. And to me, that's what transparency is all about. You have the opportunity for people to come forward, be truthful, admit a mistake, be forthright about it, and know that they're not going to be scolded with formal discipline all the time. Now, there's things that rise that have to be dealt with formal discipline, but oftentimes I think we turn to that too quickly.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to deal with is, and I have seen this over and over again at different times in my career, is we need to be nurturing these people as much as we can. And nurturing does not mean that you cut them off at the knees and write them up. Nurturing means you sit down, or somebody that you know sits down with a person and has an honest discussion with them. Now, there are people who will simply say, I don't want to listen to what you got to say. That's okay. If they say that, you try. You make a concerted effort to try. And quite honestly, I'm going to tell you to document the try. Because if this guy or this person continues to go on 2 or 3 times, and you've tried and you've tried and you tried, it may raise to the level, as Eric said, that you have to discipline. Well, if you have all those tries in a documentation scheme, then you've got pretty good evidence already. But I think the biggest issue is, as I told one of my AWs one time, I could sit here and I could write up half the staff every day, because half the staff probably does something against our code of conduct. Now, if you have a code of conduct, they're written very broadly, and you can do that a lot of times, but you don't want to do that. You want to have an effective employee. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you. I think that's a really good segue into our first of several discussion questions. And this is a question for Eric and Art, for the two of you, but then also for everyone listening. If you'd like to unmute yourself or just talk in the chat, how can we, and when I say we, I mean corrections leaders, promote accountability in our facilities? And that means true accountability, not discipline or fear or pressure. But how do we encourage folks to hold themselves accountable and to acknowledge, yeah, I've made a mistake? What are some of the ways that as leaders y'all can do that?
I think one way I've promoted accountability within Delaware's prison system is give our wardens, give our deputy wardens, give the majors, the captains, lieutenants, autonomy to kind of do their job, to kind of do what they can do and give them a little flexibility within their shift, within their, unit command, to take ownership of those areas, right? And then once you have that ownership and autonomy to kind of, fix issues at that level, then you say, look, well, we're giving you that opportunity, we're giving you that autonomy to kind of guide the way you run your unit, but you're going to be held accountable for all that stuff. And it kind of goes hand in hand, and they take real ownership. Simple things like we have the video visits with GTL on the tablets, and one of a unit commander made a decision to move those tablets to another area, to the docking stations, move them, and it worked out really well, because certain backgrounds they were worried about, showers or because it was a dorm, or people changing clothes in the background. So they took ownership and made good decisions on where the placements of those docking stations would be, because they knew that they made that decision. They had the autonomy to make that decision. So the accountability was going to be held within them, not, well, the warden said do it. So that's on the warden. You know what I mean? So that's one way we've been able to try to promote accountability, is giving that flexibility to unit commanders and those involved, give them a little autonomy to work within their units.
Yeah. And that shows trust too, right? Which I think is really powerful. And I think showing that trust also encourages people to take ownership and admit a mistake, right? Because if there's that trust and that respect, then you feel like, oh, I can share this and I'm not going to get, reamed for it, right? I'm going to get help. I'm going to get support. Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, where I was going to start is the word respect. You've got to give the respect to receive the respect. And that means the leader has to be respectful, and has to give out to everybody that level of respect, no matter if they're a brand new employee or if somebody's been around for 30 years. You've got to give them that level of respect, and hopefully you'll get that in return. After respect, if you are respecting each other, you can develop that level of trust. I have seen so many times that people come up, and you said it, somebody said it, they come up with this thing saying, well, the warden said we had to do such and such. Well, that's not holding anybody accountable, and that's not accountability. That's something most different from accountability there is. I used to hate that statement. I don't know if any other wardens on here used to hate that statement, but I hate that statement, because what we are trying to tell people is that you own your responsibility and you own your accountability.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think
Any
another
other thoughts on
way,
this? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think another way is that, staff have to see the leader apologize, be willing to be vulnerable, acknowledge that they've made a mistake. And when they see that they're willing to do that, I think that the ownership will come out even more. So, the leader has to show that, hey, I'm vulnerable. We're all vulnerable. We got to accept that as a team.
Sorry about
I
that.
agree,
Thank you. And I do want to highlight something that Lynn, who's one of our task force members, put in the chat. She wrote, assigning self audits are a good tool for staff. It's a good reminder of policy requirements and gives them an opportunity to tighten things up. Yeah, so encouraging and giving that time to reflect on one's own performance is really powerful. All right. So I think, before we even really unpack accountability, I think there's also the need to really identify what a good job performance is, right? And there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. We've discussed things like that in our previous summits. And I just want to highlight here a study that I found when I was doing research for this. presentation about what makes a good corrections officer. And these were the 4 categories that these researchers found when they were asking corrections officers what makes a good corrections officer. There were 4 categories: performance, so doing your job right; answerability, doing the job right; attributability, owning your mistakes. I don't know why they had to use such a big SAT word for that, and then reliability, having each other's backs, right? So we're hearing from COs here what makes a good CO. And I think these are also really good ways to categorize performance and accountability, right? If we are accountable to one another, that means that we are owning our mistakes. We are having each other's backs. We are doing the job right. So I think being able to frame those accountability conversations and tie them back to a good job performance or what makes a good CO makes it less about punishment and more about improvement, right? Accountability is also really sort of a team approach, right? It requires teamwork, even though it recognizes that success is dependent on every individual's performance. Team accountability means that it's not just about the job that I do, right? It's recognizing that the job I do is going to impact all the people around me, right? And if I do my job right, it's going to make their jobs easier, right? And if I'm messing up all the time, it's going to make their jobs harder. So there's that individual accountability, but also that sort of team approach. And again, taking responsibility for actions and outcomes. So it's not enough to say, you know, the warden told me to do this, right? But it's also like, okay, what was the outcome of that action? I do want to highlight too that that phrase that I hear so frequently: bad apples, bad apples, bad apples, right? And I think that we tend to forget that the second part of that phrase is that one bad apple spoils the bunch, right? We're only as strong as our weakest link, right? And so we want to make sure that everybody is sort of attuned and understanding what is expected of them. And then again, what we owe each other as colleagues, as teammates, particularly in a field like corrections, right, where safety and security are so paramount.
Yeah, I want to touch upon that for just a second, Jessica.
Yes, please.
What that boils down to is that we're all responsible for that quote unquote bad apple. So if we see somebody, I used to say, if you see somebody who's getting ready to jump off the cliff, it's your responsibility to go talk to that person. Now, of course, everybody said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm blah, blah, blah. Well, that's your responsibility, because that's you making the institution safer. That's making you take ownership of that institution. And that's what we're trying to get to. All these things kind of link together, but accountability is taking responsibility for talking to that person.
Absolutely. Thank you. One of the things that I know in previous leadership summits that we've had, you know, we've talked about some of the challenges around staff morale, staff recruitment, staff retention. And you know, I think there are some tensions there, right, between wanting to hold folks accountable while also wanting to make sure that we're not driving people away, that we're not being overly harsh, that we're creating an environment that people want to work in. And so I'm curious from Art or Eric or anyone really, what have been some of your biggest challenges related to accountability, both either for yourself or for you know, folks that are working with you?
Well, one of the things that we all have to do, and I don't know if we all do it well, is we've got to remember the multi-generational folks that we have working for us. You know, what a Gen Z thinks about things is different than what a baby boomer thinks about things. And I always point out that baby boomers are one step removed from World War II for the most part. And we were all told, if you had a legal request, you followed it. Now, Gen Zs are much more attuned to that than our millennials, according to the literature, that millennials in particular, but Gen Zs, they want to know, why are we doing this? And if you don't take the time to provide that teaching moment, then you're going to lose that accountability. You have to take the time to do the teaching.
Yeah, I think nothing is less effective than because I said so, right? I mean, I don't think that motivates a whole lot of people because I said so, right? I think that why is really important.
Yeah. I
Any
was
other
gonna add-
thoughts? Yes,
I
Eric, go
thought-
for it.
Okay. I was going to add that, we see that command and control is really lost. And that's a field that we're in. We are used to command and control and do what we say. Don't ask me why. And we find that more effective measures are give direction and provide support.
And
So,
coach.
yes.
Mhm.
So, I think that's part of a trend and, an acronym comes to play. I don't know if this is the right time to bring it up there, Jessica, about OARS.
Oh, that we got a whole slide for that coming up also. Any
But,
other, does anyone else want to share anything else about the challenges they're experiencing?
I think a big challenge in corrections for accountability is training. When I know, at least when I made lieutenant 20 years ago, they gave me a gold, took my silver badge, gave me a gold badge, told me go be a lieutenant. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
thank God I was, I played sports and kind of had a concept of leadership, but it was kind of like you kind of trial by error, right? And you learn from other supervisors and that kind of thing. I think training is a big challenge. We got to train our leaders to hold people accountable because it's a tough job. That mid-level supervisor, that lieutenant, that captain, that's a huge task because, 2 months ago, I was working the tier doing head counts with the crew. And now I'm the lieutenant. I'm going to walk down with my starch white shirt with the gold badge. And I'm going to say, why the hell is count not done? And why, you know what I mean? You just, some people don't know what to do when they get that gold badge and they go way off to the other end. And COs never forget anything, you know what I mean? How you were as a CO impacts how, your reputation as a lieutenant. So I just think that training on how, when you start to enter that mid-level supervisor is a big thing so that you can properly hold people accountable. So that's, and then there's some people that just, they get lieutenant and, they come around the unit once a shift and write their name in red ink in the logbook and then leave and never look up and never hold nobody accountable. And that takes your go-getter staff, they start getting upset because they see, to Art's point about, we're all responsible for correcting people and the sergeants or the corporals or whoever sees it going on, but they say the lieutenant walks right by it, I'm going to stop caring, you know what I mean? And then it just snowballs,
That's
Right.
a very good.
Yeah. Yeah. If you don't care as a leader, you can't expect your people to care.
And the other point is we have to continually look for ways to train ourselves if we're not getting the training from the organization. Because one of the things that I always saw happening, and I can say this now because I'm no longer in the Bureau of Prisons, is the first thing that happened when you were tied of funds or tied of people is people started dropping training, which is probably the worst thing that you can do is to drop training, but I see it still happening. Oh, we don't have enough people to cover a shift, so we're going to cancel this training. Well, I take that as if you're going to be a leader, you got to figure out ways of getting some information to help you be a better leader, no matter what's happening in your organization. That's not easily said, and that's not easily done. But I think if you are going to be a leader in this field, in this discipline, that you've got to take some ownership of that yourself.
Yeah.
Not that the organization doesn't have the ownership, but you've got to take some ownership yourself.
Yeah. Thank you. Any
Hi.
other thoughts?
Yeah, hi.
Yes, Dawn.
I just wanted to piggyback on what Art said. When staffing is scarce, which it often is, sometimes we can tend to let things slip because we know that, oh, sorry, my dogs.
That's okay.
Someone is covering another shift and they may not be familiar with what's really going on there. Hang on a second. I'm sorry. I'm going to close my door.
That's okay. This is a pet friendly environment.
They had to wait until I unmuted myself
of course.
to start barking.
Of
Anyway,
course.
so this one person is covering for another one's shift or so on and so forth, and then pretty soon the accountability starts faltering. So that is a big challenge, all the way from the warden all the way down. The other thing that does is it doesn't allow the warden enough time then to actually think about things that are going on because they're too busy in the hamster wheel, just going round and round and round. So we really have to watch that even though our staffing might be short, that we still hold the same level of expectations of people and of ourselves as well. And that we have to stop and think about the big picture when you're the warden, because staff are looking toward you for that and you cannot let that go.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a couple of wonderful books out there on this, and that one of them is a book called Leaders Eat Last. I don't know if anybody's ever read that book or not, but the whole premise of the book is that leadership makes sure that everybody else is taken care of first, and that they eat last on that for that reason. That's a military adage that you take care of your troops before you take care of yourself. But I think it's something that is very important in our business also. And we're not. I get upset when people say we're a military model, because that we have to evolve beyond that. But that's basic supervision. And the other thing on that is basically and I put this out as a leader, whether you're a sergeant, whether you're a lieutenant, whether you're an associate warden, you have to develop a presence on that compound. And that presence is what you're talking about, and what Eric talked about so eloquently, is you make people feel okay because they can come to you and they know you're not going to cut them off at the knees. You have to develop that presence. And that happens through a lot of reasons. That's another great book if you ever want to read it. And that's called Presence.
And Allison, I wonder if you could find a link to these books and maybe put them in the chat. I'm not sure who the author of Leaders Eat Last is, but I can't imagine there's many books with that title.
There's not. I can get them for you if you need to.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And also we'll be sending out the slides to everyone after the fact. And so we can also add those books to that information as well. So some of the challenges that I think we've kind of already talked about are on here. We've got staff retention and morale. I think the other thing, and this is also tied to staff training, is just how complex corrections work is. I think corrections folks are sort of in the middle of this, these seemingly divergent ideals, right? Where there's safety, security, but there's also rehabilitation, right? There's that sort of military approach, Art, like you mentioned, but then there's also the recognition that people aren't necessarily going to thrive in that kind of environment, right? I think another thing that makes accountability really challenging, and this is across the board for everybody, not just corrections folks, is how those personal relationships fall into play, particularly if you're in a really small community. There's that code of silence, right? That fear of owning up to a mistake. And then staff training was mentioned as well. And I included that here again, because I I feel like a lot of staff training may not necessarily prepare people for the job, right? It might go over a lot of the technical stuff, the hard skills, if you will. But does it lean into the soft skills, the how to interact with incarcerated people, how to interact with colleagues appropriately, some of the do's and don'ts, again, the more sort of complex stuff that isn't as easy as, showing someone a policy, for example.
Hey, Jessica,
Yes.
I'm sorry. I just want to say
Go for
something
it.
about the complexity of the work, because I had something occur this morning that demonstrates that complexity of work and how confusing this job can be to the frontline staff if there's not appropriate communication down. And you're talking about accountability. We just
Yeah.
had a policy review committee meeting for Delaware Department of Corrections, and we're looking at pat searches of transgender, or searches, period, strip searches and pat searches of transgender offenders. And we may be leaning toward, and this is being pushed through a lawsuit as well, maybe leaning toward that population having a preference on what gender pat searches them. So, we've always preached cross-gender strip searches is actually against PREA policy, PREA standards and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But now here we are, we may be introducing a new policy that now that may be permitted if it's a transgender offender and all this ins and out. And same with the push of MAT. For years, we've been combating Suboxone coming into the facilities and Subutex and all this stuff. And we're doing MAT. So it's very complex for the line staff to figure, I've been searching down, we've been investing in all this mailroom security stuff to detect Suboxone coming in. Now we're giving it out at MedPass. You know what I mean? What are we doing? And it confuses staff, right? So I think those things highlight the complexity of this work.
Yeah. And I've seen similar reactions when I've worked with folks when condoms start being distributed in facilities. I don't know if that's something that folks have experienced here, but I have been in some facilities where all of a sudden boxes with condoms show up for incarcerated people to use. And I know that really blows people's minds and people get really confused and they don't understand why. And it always makes me wonder how those things are introduced to staff. What is the explanation that's given? Are people able to ask questions and that kind of stuff? I've definitely seen that pop up in a lot of different ways.
All this undercuts the issue that if you're going to have a major change of your culture, a major change of your policy, that you have to take time to go out and teach your staff. I will tell you, I didn't always do that well sometimes. And whenever you don't do that well, you usually fall on your face a little bit and you have to backtrack. But you need to take the time and go out and say, okay, we're getting ready to give condoms to all of our inmates to make sure that there is not a transmission of sexual disease through that process. We're not condoning same sex. We're not condoning sex at all because that's against the rules. But if an individual is going to do that, we want to make sure that they live through that process. And though I can remember this discussion when I worked in the Health Services Department of the Bureau, is that we were having an on discussion about do we or do we not. So that's a complexity. That's a huge complexity. Yeah. And the advocates out there think, why wouldn't you? That's simple. You give them a condom. Well, it doesn't become that simple inside of an institution.
Yeah.
Just to add to that kind of complexity,
Please.
There's also that issue, like the issue Shane's talking about, where we also in Washington are in the situation where we have litigation against us around transgender individuals, and we're trying to reach some agreement with the agency, which is Disability Rights Washington in our state. And we also have an opposing view that has a very strong voice out there around how and what you do with transgender individuals. So our staff get really confused because they hear both of these different viewpoints coming their way, and then they have their own, personal investment in what they think's right and wrong. And talking them through that, I've had to bring a lot of training into the state to try to prepare them for kind of sudden change that happens when you're up against litigation. So it's kind of like putting the cart before the horse oftentimes, and really difficult to get staff buy-in when you have to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think complexity is especially challenging in the corrections world, which is sort of designed to be very like 90-degree angles, square edges, everything in its place, and then you bring in this shade of gray that really kind of mucks up the works, and it kind of creates this, wait, what are we supposed to do about this? Yeah, and I do agree with you that setting aside that time to really allow people to say their concerns, their fears, what have you, but then also providing here's why and here's what it means for us and all of that, I think is really, really important. Another sort of study, I guess, that I discovered in my research was really highlighting some of the thoughts from corrections leaders around some of the issues that the field has, particularly around staff misconduct. And a lot of this has to do with data collection, that there isn't enough evidence regarding the causality behind staff misconduct. We can sort of in tune what it is, our guts might tell us, and that existing staff accountability systems are not prevention focused. And I think that kind of along the line of the condom discussion that we were having, which is really all about prevention, that looking at accountability in a preventative way is not something that a lot of systems do. They're very reactive, right, instead of proactive. There's also a lot of variation in policy approaches to training, to response. So one system's going to handle things completely different than the other. And there may also be just a lack of awareness, speaking of litigation, that staff may not be fully aware of liabilities associated with their actions, right? They're not really necessarily given all of that information up front of here's what might happen if this policy is not followed, or et cetera. And we talked about staff training earlier, and here it is again, that there can be a real divergence between what is in the staff training and what actually happens in the workplace, right? Experiential learning is so important, right? But I think staff training, at least a lot of the training that I've seen in my work, really ignores the intellectual and emotional complexity of corrections work. That it really is such a people-focused profession, and that staff are oftentimes not fully prepared for that. Those hard skills are emphasized, but the soft skills, and I even don't like that phrasing of hard and soft, but those softer, less quantifiable skills are often not promoted in staff training materials.
And that's exactly where good leadership comes in. I mean, we can teach anybody how to put on a pair of handcuffs, or how to put on a pair of leg irons. Yeah, even though I have seen many not put on right, we can teach anybody how to do those things. But we can't teach everybody, or we haven't been able to teach everybody, how do you have a discussion with an incarcerated person that brings that person not to react towards you or to the institution, but telling him, and this goes to employees and incarcerated persons, telling them why you're doing something. I always used to tell people that, and I'm going to go back a little bit, I always used to tell people, inmates will typically do whatever you ask them to do, as long as you tell them why they need to do it. I was taught that by an old lieutenant back in 1975. And, it's just as true today as it was then. And I think that goes for staff too. Staff typically, they may not like it. They don't even have to agree with it. But most of the time, as long as you're taking the time to tell them why you're doing it and to give them the training, and training, I think training has a misnomer sometimes. Sometimes just sitting down and talking to somebody has just as much good as any formal training ever will have. I can remember that time and time again. We're just sitting down and having the discussion does a lot of good things.
I could not agree more, absolutely. And I think the professional boundaries as an example of where staff training has a tendency to diverge from what happens on the ground. A lot of training, again, that I've seen, this is not universal, focuses on how to avoid inappropriate relationships, but that may not necessarily prepare staff to navigate those complex dynamics of seeing incarcerated people day in and day out, spending time with them, getting to know them, building positive but professional relationships with them, which is so important to rehabilitation, to safety, but is not always, emphasized in a lot of staff trainings. And so folks come into the work and they may not know how to navigate those dynamics. And I think that's the perfect kind of example of something that perhaps is better done as part of a discussion rather than a lecture-based training. So there are several stages of accountability, and we're going to talk in a little bit about some of the different methods of accountability, but accountability is more than just, a disciplinary and conversation, right? There's sort of a dial or a scale, if you will, of different opportunities where as leaders, you can intervene to create that accountability beyond just the conversation or that limit, right? The mention, for example, is explaining the expectation, right? And noticing, hey, I'm seeing that you're struggling with this. Can I help you with that, right? Before you immediately go to a disciplinary action, checking in, inviting someone for a conversation, right? As opposed to seeing, oh, you messed up, done, right? That there are different stages to it and that it is, again, complex. That's kind of the word of the day here. I think another tool for staff accountability that sometimes is lacking is staff evaluations. And I imagine everyone does staff evaluations with their folks, but I would encourage people to kind of take a step back and think about, okay, is my staff evaluation process effective? Is it a conversation or is it just a checklist, right? Am I just checking off, oh, they did this, this, that, and not even talking to that staff person, right? Staff evaluation should occur regularly rather than in response to an incident, right? So if it's every 6 months or every year or what have you, one of the things that I'm always told by my leadership is that nothing in a staff evaluation should be a surprise, right? There's no gotchas here. That's not the intention here. So in that sort of evaluating conversation, both people should know sort of what to expect, what's going to be discussed. There should never be any sort of, aha, I got you on this. Any thoughts, Art or Eric, on staff evaluations?
Eric, you got anything?
Yeah, I was going to say it's important to get the employees' input on what they want to improve on, self-improvement, goals they have, engage them as part of, like you said, it shouldn't be a surprise, but also engaging them on ways that they can, aspire to higher levels and improve their career, et cetera. So engaging them, asking them where they see themselves in 5 years, and where they see themselves in the next year, what training they would like to attend, things of that nature, where it's not just, a critique, but it's also, looking towards the future. What do you want to accomplish?
One of the things I always ask staff, especially my upper tier staff, is I say, okay, what are your strengths? But I also would say, tell me what your weaknesses are. Because where your weaknesses are what we may need to find something to help you manage those weaknesses. And we all have them. I mean, we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses. Maybe Shane doesn't, but hi, Shane, how are you? Maybe Shane doesn't, but everybody else, we all have strengths and weaknesses. And I always want to sit down with my staff and say, okay, how can I help you manage that weakness?
Yeah. Yeah, I always considered it a bit of a red flag if someone says they don't have any weaknesses. I'm like, are you sure about that? Because like you said, we all do. We all have stuff that we want to improve upon, right? All right, so let's talk about just the actual accountability conversation. You know that you're going to have a staff person come in to speak with you. You need to potentially have an awkward conversation with them about how they about the performance gap, about how they messed up or what have you. What are some of the things that you all do to prepare for that actual conversation?
Well, mine starts with the orientation of the employee, Jessica. And I start off by saying, giving them my expectations, but I also tell them, you know, if you're caught up in something, come in and tell me the truth. Don't lie
Right.
about it, and I won't lie to you. If you tell me what's wrong, if you tell me what happened, and if I have the ability, and this all depends upon a lot of factors, but if I have the ability to help you through that process and not to cut you off at the knees, I will help you as long as you're able to articulate that. Now, I also tell them there are certain things that I have no power over, and that if you get involved in these things, I will have to take, and I find out about it and it's sustained, I will have to take action. But I would always tell people, if you come in and you bring contraband in the institution, and the investigation asks you that, and you are bringing contraband into the institution, come talk to me and tell me. Because guess what? If I have any power, you may not get prosecuted for that. And I know I'm going to the other end, but if you don't tell me and they build a case and all that happens, guess what? That district attorney or that prosecuting attorney is going to want their case. And you won't have any, you meaning the warden or the leadership, will have very little say in that.
Yeah, you can't provide support to people who are not upfront about
Thank
mistakes
you.
that they may have made.
He said it much better than I did.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on preparing for that conversation?
Yeah, I think you gotta take your feelings out of it.
Yep.
And if you know at the moment you're not able to do that, you need, my opinion is you need to push pause. And pause for a moment so you know you're not acting on feelings, and get your thoughts where you gotta be specific. Use, specific examples. So, and preparing for an accountability conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think this slide kind of touches on some of the things that you both kind of talked about. It may sound silly, but I would almost encourage folks to like rehearse what you're going to say, because you want to choose your words carefully. You want to make sure that you're focused on the right problem. And you want to be able to ask questions and ask why, right? Why did this person make this mistake? What was not accessible to that person? What would have made that person make a different choice, right? You want to have your documentation, as we talked about, your policies and all of that. But I think it's also important to focus on the harm that was done potentially, or the harm that could have been done by this mistake, right? The harm is not necessarily that a policy was broken, right? The harm could be an issue around security or something like that. To talk about why this is an issue. It's not about breaking the policy, right? It's about potentially creating some kind of harm. Speaking of feelings, Eric, this kind of alludes to what you were talking about in terms of some of the innate reactions that folks might have when they're presented with a challenge, right? So this is called the path to action model. No need to remember that, but essentially it kind of goes through an incident and how we react to it and all the different stages that come up. And I think a good example is like we're cut off on the freeway, right? When there's an incident like that, we tell ourselves a story about why that is, right? So we assume that that person is a jerk. We may not think about what kind of day that person might be having. We may not think about where that person's going to or where they're coming from or what happened to them earlier that day. We're just like, oh, that person's a jerk. And then we have a feeling. We react to the story that we tell ourselves about that person. We get angry, right? And then we react out of anger. We might flip them the bird or who knows what, or slow down or whatever it is, right? As opposed to taking a moment to think, okay, is that the real story? Is that the right story? Is that person just coming from an appointment where they found out that, they have some diagnosis or something, and that's why they're driving that way, just as an example. We want to make sure that we're telling ourselves the right story about what's happening. And Eric, I think that that kind of alludes to what you were talking about your feelings, right? So if you're
Yep.
angry, if you're disappointed that someone messed up and maybe you're taking it personally because it's a reflection on you, right? As a leader, you might tell yourself a story about how that person is just irresponsible, or that person is no good at their job, or that person is, whatever, rather than allowing that person to tell you the right story. And there are a few ways to encourage that sort of right story. And I think one of the primary ways is to be curious and to avoid assumptions, right? What's going on for that person that resulted in that behavior? Why would someone who is a good employee, because we want to sort of start with that foundation, right? Why would a good employee, why would someone who wants to do the right thing do this, right? Focus on the gap, the performance gap, the difference between what you expected and what that person did. Now, it says here, allow space for feelings, and that really refers to the person that you're talking to, right? So that person who is being told that they messed up or is being held accountable is likely to have some feelings about that. And we don't want to say, no, you're not allowed to feel upset. You're not allowed to feel discouraged. Encourage that person to say, yeah, you know what, I'm feeling XYZ, right? But you also want to make sure that you're sticking to the facts. Like, yes, you feel this way, you feel disappointed, you feel upset, but also here are the facts about what happened. 1, 2, 3, right? Now here's the ORS conversation that, oh, sorry, Art, did you want to say something about this slide?
Back up for just a slide, please.
This one?
Nope, the next one.
This one?
There you go. Thank
Okay.
you. Make sure when you're dealing with employees, and one of the things the leader has to know is they have to know their employees. And if you have an employee that is going to be reactive, is going to call you every name under the book. I don't like being called an X, Y, and Z, never did. But if I knew I was going to have an employee that was going to react that way, I said, okay, take a breath. Let that person get off what they've got to say, and then let's go and let's talk about the facts. And one of the things that I used to use is a technique that's gone back again for many, many years. I would repeat. Now, this is going to sound kind of funky, but I would say the guy said blah, 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 blah. And I said, okay, did I hear you say blah, 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 blah? And, you would be surprised how much that tells the employee that, number one, you're listening, but number two, that you're interested in what they said. And I think that's
100%.
using that technique. And for those social workers in the audience, I learned that in graduate school with social work a long time ago, is you got to get the person to understand their responsibility. So you kind of say, did I hear you say that? It goes a long ways.
Absolutely.
That's all I wanted to say.
And that's actually tied in really perfectly with this ORS concept. And Eric, this was something that you brought up earlier. ORS is sort of a counseling technique, actually. It's from something called motivational interviewing. It was designed to help counselors work with people who are dealing with addiction issues. But I think it's also a really powerful tool just for navigating difficult conversations in general. And the ORS is an acronym. These things always are. It starts with open-ended questions, right? You don't want to ask yes, no questions. You want to invite dialogue, and you can do that by asking open-ended questions. You want to provide affirmations that shows empathy, right? That shows that you care. The reflections ensure understanding, and that's Art, what you were talking about. Like, what I'm hearing you say is blah, blah, blah. And that gives that person an opportunity to either correct you, right? If there's a misunderstanding, or to say, actually, you know what, that's not how I feel. I'm sorry I said that, right? In that example. And then summarizing sort of highlights all the key points and ensures that everyone is sort of on the same page, right? So here's what we talked about, 1, 2, 3, here's what we agreed to, X, Y, Z. Is that what you agree as well, etc. So I encourage folks to really use the ORS as a tool to help you navigate those conversations. This is how I do. I think every conversation I have, I tend to go to my ORS because I found them to be really helpful in facilitating dialogue, particularly if it's an uncomfortable situation. Eric or Art, do either of you want to add anything to this slide here?
I mean, I was just agreeing the whole time, listening to you and just reflecting on the principles of that. And, you know, it made me think about Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and the principles taught in there. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. So these principles all tie together in building strong relationships.
Yeah. And, you know, thinking back to staff training as an example, I can't imagine the ORs are something that are ever discussed in staff training. And I would encourage folks to maybe sneak something like this in there, because I think this is a really easy to understand, really helpful tool to help people, again, navigate conversations, difficult conversations, and to ensure understanding rather than kind of stopping the conversation entirely. There are a few things when you're having these accountability conversations, or just when you're talking about accountability in general, that are important to avoid, right? And one of them is being indirect or being unclear, right? So a hint or an innuendo, right? So dancing around the topic rather than just going straight towards, here's what I understand is true. Passing the buck, or that sort of good cop, bad cop thing, for lack of a better way to describe it. And this is very similar to the, oh, well, the warden told me to, right? Or someone else told me to, or I was told to do this, or I have to do this, blah, blah, blah. All of that is a way of sort of eliminating your own personal responsibility from the conversation, right? Don't expect folks to read your mind, right? I think that question of, do you know why I asked to talk with you? I think that's a really common way that folks maybe start these conversations, but it's not necessarily very helpful, right? You're expecting that person to read your mind, and you're being unclear, right? You're being, you know, a little shy. And this is a conversation that you really want to lean into. I think the most important thing that you want to avoid is inconsistency. And that kind of pops up a lot in this making an example of situation, right? Where, you know, there may be something that a lot of folks are doing, and you find one person who has messed up in this really common way, and you're like, I'm going to make an example out of them by throwing the book at them, right? So that everyone gets the message that this is not acceptable, right? By doing that, you're creating inconsistency. You're holding people to different standards, right? And that poor person that got in trouble where all their other colleagues didn't, it creates tension, it creates conflict, right? So it's super important that if you're, you know, holding one person accountable for a particular action, that is applied across the board. Any thoughts on any other things to avoid? Yes.
Okay, what you just talked about also is a trust builder slasher more than anything else, because, you know, there's no secrets on a compound. And if you do something with one that you don't do with another, or at least in the same realm, everybody's going to know about it by the close of shift. And if you're trying to build trust, there's nothing worse than saying that you have your favorites.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Very true.
Okay.
Hi, it's Dawn. I
Yes,
just
Dawn.
wanted to say that nobody likes to have these conversations, but as leaders, as supervisors, it's something that we have to do. It's our duty to ensure that we have good conversations with our staff, that they understand what they might have done wrong. And these conversations can be difficult, but what you've spelled out, Jessica, are really good tools to use. And I don't think I've ever seen it spelled out that way in all of my years in corrections, where it's broken down like that. So using these tools can make those conversations, I think, a little bit easier if you're prepared to understand what possibly could happen, and you know how you're going to react when things do happen. But again, nobody likes to have these kinds of conversations, but they're absolutely necessary. So to have these tools in your pocket makes it a little less scary to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and Dawn, you just made me think of something Art said about knowing your staff, right? I think you want to be prepared for how you're going to react, but it's also helpful to anticipate, if you know that staff person, to think about, okay, what's their reaction going to be, right? If I know this person well enough, I might know if I say this or if I approach this way that it's going to be a non-starter, right? And then finally, if you're going to have this kind of accountability conversation, it has to end with some kind of action plan, right? So that may be, key goals for performance, a specified time period. I'm going to follow up with you after 6 months or what have you. Some sort of metrics for measurement. How are you going to measure improvement? You want to be able to name resources that will help enable closing the performance gap. Whatever that person needs, you want to be able to name that for that person, including that follow-up schedule, right? Defining the benefits of achieving the goals. If you are able to maintain this is what will happen. This will be the good outcome. But you also want to be really clear about what will happen if the agreement is not fulfilled, if that person continues to make the same mistakes, for example. What are going to be some of the outcomes of that, so that that person's making an informed decision, right, about how they want to perform their expectations in the future. It's also important to understand that accountability is a balance, right? You want to be a nurturer and a disciplinarian. You can't be both. You got to find somewhere in the middle. And I think that that's, again, part of that complexity and that tension that is inherent to a lot of this work. And a lot of people are going to respond differently to different types of nurturing or discipline, right? You may have to try more than once. You may have to try different approaches. You may have to get tough with some folks, and some other folks may not need that, right? So everyone's kind of going to respond differently. And as a leader, you kind of have to be able to read how people are going to respond and what they need. Art, was there anything that you wanted to add here, particularly around the Douglas factors, which we will provide a link for later, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what the Douglas factors are and how they've helped you?
Yeah, it really goes to the point that you made earlier, is you and Eric has made earlier. The Douglas factors are off of a federal case several years ago, 1981, I believe, which talked about those things that you had to take into account as a, thank you, whoever put that up, that you had to put up, you had to go over if you're going to discipline employees. And what I found it did, I would write them down. There's no requirement that you write them down, but I would take every Douglas factor and I would write down what or what wasn't part of this factor that was dealing with this discipline. And what it did for me is, you talked about the causality and you talked about not having evidence. This told me up front if I had enough evidence to move forward or did not. And that's not your desire. Your desire is to help the person get through it. But if you got to go through this phase, you want to make sure that you've taken the time to make sure that you've crossed the T's. And the Douglas factors really does that well. And I won't tell you the number of times that I've sat down to write the Douglas factors that I said, I ain't got enough. I don't have stuff here to be able to discipline this employee. And yes, my gut tells me that I should be disciplining this employee. But if I don't have it and I can't put it in black and white and I can't articulate it, then let's see if we can figure out a different way of doing it. Because going to a hearing or having to go to a hearing sometimes, maybe 5, 6, 7 years past the time that you took the discipline. And you've got to be able to say why you did what you did. I find the Douglas factor is probably the best tool I ever used. And I'm not advocating that you do this, but there may be other tools out there. But I found that to be the best tool that I ever had, that I could sit down and I could actually say, okay, this guy has a horrible record for sick leave. He's never here. We've talked to him 5 times, da, 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 da. Or you might find that saying, this person, something's going on with this person because he has never had a problem before. Mm-hmm. And you need to know those kinds of things before you make your final decisions.
Absolutely. And taking that history into account is important. All right. So we are nearing the end of our time. This is our last discussion question. I'd like to be able to try to leave things off on a good note and have folks maybe share some of the successes that they've had. particularly in balancing accountability with staff morale, which I think are two very, two topics that come up a lot in the conversations that we have in these leadership summits. I'm wondering either Art, Eric, or anyone who's listening would like to share maybe a success story or some other tool or resource that has been really helpful for them in trying to navigate that balance.
Well, I think that if you have an employee and you do exactly what, you don't do exactly what we said, but if you talk in this in an open-minded fashion, and you have this accountability discussion in an open-minded fashion, and you're honest with the person, and you allow the person to discuss it with you, oftentimes they'll tell you, hey, Warden, you got to discipline me. Now that sounds crazy, but I've had people tell me that after the discussion. And I said, wait, let's talk about this. What do you need? Where do you go? And, it really boils down to what we talked about up front. You tell the employee that you know that he's a good employee or she's a good employee. You know they don't want to do this thing that has caused them to have the accountability discussion. You tell them, I have told them, I don't really like having these discussions, but we need to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are all success stories.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of power too in acknowledging like your own discomfort in having that conversation. That vulnerability that Eric mentioned too. I think it's okay to say, you don't want to have this conversation. I don't want to have it either, but here's why we have to, right?
I think we also have to remember to be progressive in holding people to account. So, you don't have to go to the formal discipline right away, but take the steps, start out like we've all been talking about. Start with the dialogue, using oars, making sure everybody understands you got feedback, you shared the mission, the task at hand, etc. And now you go back and you have a one-on-one coaching. Somebody that doesn't understand it or it's not performing as they should, you take the time to coach them individually, and then you rise it up from there to hold to account. It may be an informal counseling letter, etc. And then finally you move on to formal discipline. But accountability has got to be progressive, or it's not going to be. We'll lose that trust factor back to the video that took place at the beginning. The video really just said it all. You've got to establish the trust and have transparency where people want to come forward. They got to know that when they raise their head up, it's not going to be that whack-a-mole syndrome, where as soon as they stick their head up, they're whacked. No, they stick their head out and, share a mistake without getting whacked. So.
Yeah, because everyone's looking, right? If my colleague raises their head and they get whacked, that's going to stop me from putting my hand up if I notice something, right? Because I don't want to get whacked, as an example.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you have to also be able to explain that to other staff, not the board, not going past confidentiality and those kind of things. But some staff, I've had staff coming, what do you mean you didn't put that person on the street? And I would usually say something like, well, that's my decision. I appreciate how you're coming about that. But what we're trying to do is save this employee who's demonstrated X, Y, and Z for many years without getting into the weeds.
Mm-hmm.
Because you'll get that. I don't know if Eric ever got that, but I got it several times saying, what do you mean? What do you mean you didn't put the person on the street? Or what do you mean you didn't fire the person? And, you need to be able to tell people, I didn't fire the person because I think we need to have an obligation to help the person.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to send out the slides. They will have links to all these various documents that we've referenced throughout this presentation. If you are not already signed up for our newsletter, I encourage you to do so. This little QR code here will take you to a page to sign up for the newsletter. We send one out monthly. It's a really great way to keep informed of all the various stuff that we're doing, including our leadership summits, other resources. We also have a website here. We have an email address. If anyone has any questions for me or for any of the speakers or for anyone else on our task force, please feel free to shoot us an email. We are absolutely available. Even if it's just to kind of talk through some sticky situations, don't hesitate to reach out. We like to pair folks with someone on our task force to just to help, just have a coach, right, a peer to walk through particular situations. We do have a couple more leadership summits coming up. We have one on April 20th focused on staff retention. We have another one in July focused on women leaders in corrections. You will get a follow-up email with this that will have the registration link for the upcoming one in April if you'd like to register. There are also some really exciting things coming out of the project in the coming months that we're not ready to announce just yet, but look for mention in an upcoming newsletter for other ways for folks to really get involved in this project and to have more conversations like this one. We still have 10 minutes for questions or thoughts if anyone has anything to add. If you are going to leave or when this presentation is over, there will be a very, very short 2-question evaluation that will pop up. Any feedback that you have for us so that we can improve these or add things or subtract things, we really appreciate any feedback y'all have for us. And that concludes our summit. Yeah, does anyone have any final closing thoughts or anything else they'd like to share?
Well, the one thing I want to ask all the people who are on the phone call is if you have something that you want to have discussed, please send us a note about that. I mean, what we are doing is basically going over our experiences. That means task force experiences. But you may be confronting something that we need to dig into, that we need to come out and we need to have a discussion about that. We all talk about the complexities of correctional work. Well, those complexities are not the same as they were when I was a warden. And we need to have those discussions if you need us to have those discussions. So please don't be afraid to send those things to any of us.
Yes. Yeah, and I want to second that as well. The topics that we set for these leadership summits, we don't make them up, right? They really are in response to various things that folks share with us that they see our needs or questions that they have or things they want to learn more about. And so if there's a topic like that, again, just to reiterate what Art said, do not hesitate to reach out and share that with us. And you may see a future summit dedicated to that topic. Any other thoughts or questions, concerns, fears, feelings, hopes, dreams, all that stuff?
I'll tell you what, I thank you all for taking the time to do this, because again, corrections we're like the hidden profession in law enforcement. And I don't know about you all, our vacancies are higher now than they've ever been, especially coming from a pandemic. And Art talked about the generational thing. I mean, when I came in, I was happy to have a pension and, health care, and I got to work overtime. You know what I mean? That was a blessing to be able to work some overtime. A lot of kids, they all want to bring their phone into the jail. I was scared to even say anything to my captain, you know what I mean? And now I got officers arguing with a captain about where they're assigned, or they only want to work outside patrol, or it's very complex now with just, and the way we did business in the past is not getting through to retain some of these officers, because some of them don't care about the pension, or they want something now, you know what I mean? So it's very complex, and we've offered signing bonuses, all kinds of incentive, and it's just not keeping people in this profession. So I think anything we do, like things like this, is going to help out the profession going forward.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, we're all feeling that, Shane.
Yeah, if there's any comfort to be found in not being alone in that struggle, I hope you're feeling it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna stick on for a few more minutes. If folks have any other questions, otherwise you're all free to go. Take good care of yourselves, practice your oars. Let me know if you have any successes. I'd love to be able to hear about those. Have a wonderful day, and hope to see you all at our next summit in April.
Thank you, guys.